Hello, thank you for coming to our webinar today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered here today from Flying Arts. They are the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that colonialism is an ongoing process and that sovereignty was never ceded. So I'm here from Flying Arts and I'm joined with Elizabeth Willing. So Flying Arts is a not-for-profit organisation that was established in 1971, and we're dedicated to supporting artists across Queensland in a number of capacities through the Regional Arts Fund, the Queensland Regional Art Awards, our By Request program, and also our public programs, including creative consultations, webinars, workshops and intensives. And of course, this webinar is part of that program. If you have any questions during the webinar as Liz is talking, you can write them down in the chat, and there'll be time at the end of the webinar for Liz to answer some of those questions. I'd like to introduce Liz. Elizabeth is a Meanjin-based artist who uses food as a primary subject and material. For the past 14 years, Elizabeth has created artworks generated by acts of consumption, participatory installations, ephemeral edible sculptures, paintings, experimental dining, which engage with audience through smell, taste, sight and touch. Her works enact a sense of hospitality and engage with that as an essential concept of food. Drawing on an impressive exhibition history that involves an emphasis on creative processes, she will be discussing today ephemeral materials through a lens of sustainability, the ethics of food waste, and the use of recycled materials across various branches of her practice. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Liz. Feel free to put any questions in the chat as you think of them, and we'll come back to them at the end of the session.
Thanks, Simone. And thanks everyone for joining. Simone's done a pretty great job of introducing my practice as a whole. I don't think I need to talk too much about the overarching themes of the work. Today, I am going to be going through a range of works from the last 10 years or so, and looking at those works through the lens of sustainability. And when I'm talking about sustainability, I'm considering it in terms of environmental terms, resources and reducing waste, but also in personal terms, in terms of reducing labour, costs of making and storage as well. Personally, I feel like art making is by its nature an act which consumes a lot of energy and resources. There may be some artists which sit outside of this, of course. I found food materials hit a nerve with audiences, though. In a positive way, they can be deeply engaging and sensory, but in a negative sense, they can be perceived when used in an art context as quite wasteful. And I think that comes from a lot of people being brought up in households where people have strong feelings towards food waste. My feelings are that material is material, and my use of materials can be likened to any other material that any artists use: metal, ceramic, canvas, neon, painting, anything. And that there is a definite intention behind what I do and the materials that I choose. This topic of sustainability provides a platform to discuss the ways in which the ethics of food production, processing, consumption are tied up in my work, and my overall approach to material sourcing and disposal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a series of works, as I said, from the last 10 years or so. And I'm going to start with the works which are the most kind of heavily consuming of materials. They might seem outwardly quite excessive, but I'm going to start with the kind of excessively wasteful ones and work back to, perhaps the more sustainable works and talk about them from different angles. The two works that I'm going to show you to begin with, Milk Teeth and Kernel, I kind of can liken them to like a feast. There's a lot of food and it kind of gets consumed in a very short amount of time. So the first work, as I said, Milk Teeth, is made with chocolate milk, but specifically milk mixed with Nesquik, and it's an imprint on a window. This work gets made by constructing a sort of fish tank, a thin fish tank which gets stuck onto the window of the gallery. Then many litres of milk are poured into that fish tank, Nesquik milk, chocolate milk, and left for a little while to kind of create sediment. And then using a straw attached to the bottom of that fish tank, I suck that milk out of the vessel, the fish tank, in stages, just like you would with a glass. I am sucking the milk into my mouth, regurgitating it back into a bucket of sorts. And in the process of doing that sort of performance, which usually takes about half an hour or so, the sediment lines captured on the window's surface. And so, as I said, it takes about half an hour. It's many litres of milk, which then get thrown away. And then I remove this structure, which I've built, this fish tank on the window, and just that residue of the performance is left on the window of the gallery for the duration of the exhibition. It is a temporary work. It's ephemeral in that at the end of the exhibition, it gets wiped away. It can't be moved to another space. It has to be reproduced in each site, and it is site responsive in the sense that each gallery has different windows, and I've kind of created this in lots of different ways. Just to note, this work was specifically a response to some of the floods in Brisbane, where I noticed that after the floods there was these kind of marks of the event on glass windows where the tide lines were kind of captured, and just relating that back to my own childhood experience of drinking, say, chocolate milk, and seeing that very similar pattern or trace left on the glass. Another work which consumes a lot of food in a short amount of time but attempts to capture the traces of that particular performance or engagement is Kernel, and this is a series that I've been developing for the last 4 years or so. Kernel begins with a very large block of butter, so it's about 30 kilos in this instance. In this case, and the first time I did it, it was at a party at my house, so it wasn't a very formal event. The block of butter gets offered to guests alongside freshly cooked corn on the cob, and the guests can roll their corn on the cob over the butter and season it to their taste. And in the process of doing that, they leave the marks of the corn kernels on the surface. So sometimes they're those lovely kind of almost teeth mark kernel impressions. Other times they're sort of scraped across the surface. And then after that hosting, after that sort of moment of hospitality, the butter gets put in the fridge, cooled down, and then covered in silicone. And a copy is made in the following days in Fortin, which is a sort of plaster resin sort of material. And that object, that sculpture, becomes a performance object, a sculpture which captures that specific performance and freezes it in time. So where hospitality hosting was the performance which drives the creation of the sculpture, it's kind of frozen and that kind of gets cut off after it becomes a cast. I'm just going to show you one other slide which demonstrates the performance element of that. This was the same idea, same concept, just kind of rendered slightly differently in terms of its form. So I started off with these works. As I said, these are kinds of feasts of material, these two works, Milk Teeth and Kernel. They consume large amounts of material in their construction, and then it's about the traces going on from there in the exhibition. With Kernel, the butter piece, the sculpture can be reshown. It doesn't have to be restaged every single time the work goes onto exhibition. So in some ways it kind of has quite a long life, but it is a very large amount of material in the first instance. It's funny how when I've kind of created this butter sculpture, the amount of butter seems to offend people who see it, and yet the amount of silicone that I use is equal to the butter and the amount of Fortin as well to kind of capture the sculpture. And yet the butter seems to be taken more personally. And I guess that comes back to this kind of core idea that people can understand food and the waste of food in a very real way. And we all understand what that material costs and the value of it in our own personal lives. There's something about, and this is kind of something that can be seen across my entire practice, there's something about using excessive amounts of food, which it kind of changes people's understanding of that material, and it just can't be achieved by using smaller, more relatable amounts of food. I guess in one instance, I'm kind of offering a new way of seeing that material in a new light and understanding it in a totally different way. And what I really like about that process is that we can trace that large scale, helps us trace the material back to the site of production and the very large scale production that our food is made in factories. And so that that sort of shift in thinking is really important to my work, because I do want it to be taken. Food is always going to have a relationship to the domestic, but I want to create this jump back to the industrial, and using these very large amounts of food helps to do that and to drive that concept. So in some ways this food has all of a sudden less of a relationship to the body and more of a relationship to the machine, or as I said, the industrial. So I tried to kind of start with, like I said, the two examples of some artworks which use a very hefty amount of material but in a short amount of time. And what I'm going to do from here is kind of start to shift through and shuffle through other parts of my practice and talk about some of the other issues around sustainability in the work. The next two works I'm going to show are works that are driven and constructed through the act of consumption, audience participation, specifically eating, tasting, smelling, touching. Goosebump is the first one. This work was first made in 2009, but I've since been able to reshow it in different spaces, different scales. The work uses ephemeral biscuits, which are a sort of gingerbread biscuit, which are not really Australian. They're actually imported biscuit, but they still resonate from my childhood. And they're a nice soft gingerbread, which have a thin layer of white icing. And so I've kind of tried to camouflage these biscuits into the gallery by gluing them onto the wall with royal icing, which dries quite hard like cement. And so when this exhibition first opens, the wall looks completely white and has the appearance of being bumpy, like it has goosebumps. But the smell is quite strong of the work, clearly, with so much material in the room. And then throughout the course of the opening, I usually start eating the work, and then that kind of gives permission to audience to engage with the work in that way through consumption. Generally, all the biscuits around head height disappear first, and then people have to start to kneel down, crouch down to reach lower ones, or even climb on each other's shoulders to get to the higher ones. And so the work starts to map that engagement of the audiences. We can see the patterns of consumption on the work. And you can kind of, if you were to enter the gallery a couple of weeks into the show, the smell is still quite enticing, but also you can kind of read the clues as to whether or not the work is participatory through, say, teeth marks in the biscuits and lipstick marks around the bites. With these works, I don't put explicit notes on the work to say you can or you can't engage. Instead, I just let the work speak for itself. And if people don't feel like it's a work that they can engage with, then that's fine. It's a totally valid response. And the other work that I want to show, which very much driven by consumption, these called Pick Me Up. Again, they started in 2015, and then I've done different versions of these works in response to different sites and sizes of audiences. This specific installation did a Kinder one. So the red one, you might recognize these. These are Kinder chocolates glued onto the wall, like a painting, like a minimal painting. And then the one on the right is using a German chocolate called Ice Confect. And so both chocolates are chosen for their bright, colourful packaging, but also because they don't have any branding or barcodes or anything on the back. So they become like pixels that I can paint with on the wall. And again, sometimes I need to start this work. I need to be the first one to eat it. Initially, when it's installed, it's very clean, very straight, like a nice folded piece of origami. And then gradually throughout the course of the exhibition, it starts to be quite messy. And as the wrappers open and people take the chocolates out, you can start to see the insides of the wrappers, which are like white. And so it's quite shaggy, messy, but also it starts to erase itself through this other colours sort of showing through. These works, both Goosebump and Pick Me Up that I've just shown, are site responsive in the sense that we can make them to any scale depending on the audiences. So I wouldn't put together two large paintings like this for a very small regional gallery where the audiences couldn't possibly cope with that amount of material. I do believe the works need a certain bulk of material to kind of read in the way that I want them to. They can't be too small. But in terms of thinking about sustainability of the works, I don't also want us to get to the end of the exhibition for the work to still be full of chocolate. And so this is just a negotiation process that I usually have with the curators and the people on site about the scale and how large these works could and should be. Something else that these works try and, use, but also other works that I'll show you, I'm trying to create the maximum amount of impact with the smallest amount of material. This doesn't necessarily seem like a small amount of material, but it's actually only a few cartons. It's just that once it's laid out, it actually seems quite huge. But the sensory qualities of the work are extremely important, and I need a bulk amount of material to fill the gallery space with that smell as well. Smell is such an important part of my work because it entices people, it draws people into the work. If the work is confusing about what it is, that smell gives clues. It seduces people into that act of engaging and consumption, which can actually be a really hard thing to get people to cross the line in the gallery and actually do that. So smell is important. Another reason why using a lot of the material is important to me as well. But also I'm feeding the audiences. So this material is not wasted. The chocolates are eaten by the audience. It is, as I've said, an act of hospitality, of feeding, of making people feel welcome. And the gallery is a complicated space for that because, of course, public institutions try so hard to make sure that these spaces are welcoming and open, but they can also feel quite cold, unresponsive, and be kind of closed sometimes to audiences. And so this work is trying to push against that through the generosity of offering a taste, but it's also confusing audiences because it's using the gallery context to do that, which says don't touch. So it creates a kind of complicated dynamic, which I actually love the tension of that. And it was actually, these works were designed after I came across a Felix Gonzalez Torres work. I didn't know if I could touch it or not because, as you may know, some of those works you are allowed to eat and some you're not allowed to eat. So I am going to show some other works now, which allow me to talk a little bit about, different sort of modes of sustainability, but very specifically sustainable in terms of personal sustainability, the cost of making work, the cost of storing work, the actual logistics of storing work, transporting works. These things are suffocating for me personally as a sculptor, as a maker of design objects and installations. And also my husband is the same. So it's sort of doubled up and we don't really have room left. There's no room left. So this kind of problem of storage is a real one, and it absolutely becomes a consideration in making new works. So you'll see that in some of these works, but also the cost of freighting works is incredible. And so some of the works actually respond to that in their construction as well. And there's a lot of problem solving going into kind of trying to make sure that I'm using my financial resources as cleverly as possible as well. So a work like these, Warm Light, for example, these are based off the idea of neon, which is quite fashionable in contemporary art these last decade or two. But I kind of approached a neon maker to make what could essentially be kind of glass silly straws instead of functioning neon. And I used these glass straws and attached them to the wall as usual neon would be, but filled them with coloured liqueurs. So alcohol and other sort of sedatives and sort of used quite regularly in my work in different ways. But I was really drawn to, initially these works were designed in Germany, and all those wonderful liqueurs really jumped out at me, the really bright reds and yellows and greens and things. And then when I came back to Australia, I designed some in response to some of the local liqueurs that were being made. This is at New England Regional Art Museum. I initially made these works in Australia, and they have a wonderful local distiller. And so I kind of suck the liquid into the straws and then just sort of let it relax. And so it's sort of an unpredictable work, and the liquid is always sitting in different curves and bends, and it's never going to be able to be replicated each time it's installed. So the work does kind of get remade each time, but in such a simple way. I don't have to remake the work. It just kind of gets installed and performed in a slightly different way. These works are also elements which can get reworked in different compositions. So a piece like this uses like 10 different straws, I think. And those I kind of consider more like ingredients that I can start to rework into different compositions for future exhibitions. So instead of feeling like, oh, this body of work has to keep like building and growing, instead I see these as sort of building blocks that I can keep moving around to reinvent the work as well. So for me, that's helpful because I don't have to keep fabricating new pieces, but I also don't have to store a lot of items as well. This work is called Mova Prep. It was designed initially, I saw a young child who was eating one of these sherbet straws, these colourful rainbow sherbet straws, and the end had been snipped off and he was just pouring the sherbet straight into his mouth. And there was this moment of like horror and total joy and nostalgia in terms of my memories for eating these kind of quite tacky lollies that you might get from, the fair or a show bag or something. But I was also thinking about how this straw became an extension of the esophagus, or the body of the alimentary canal. And so I decided to turn this work into a very large sort of intestinal work. The straws kind of get joined together in a very simple way, just folding the ends and sticking them inside the one next to it. And although I'm kind of thinking about this like an intestinal work, it actually has probably more of a relationship with like industrial tubing than something more organic. And that's a result of the work being made of essentially an industrial product. I don't really believe this is food. I think that sits more on the kind of toy spectrum, or as I said, sort of industrial matter. But in the process of making this work, joining the ends together, I snip both ends off and I join them, and the sherbet just spills out. I can't help it. That's just what happens. And I keep those traces on the ground of the work. And so all the snaking trails of sherbet and the spills are all remnants of the making process. So much like the initial works that I talked about with kernel and milk teeth, with the milk on the window, the traces of making and the performance of construction are really important in my final displays. Again, it's not a huge amount of material. It just seems like it is because of the scalability of these straws. So it's actually quite an economical work to make, and I like that it can scale. This is the largest version that you can see in this slide, but it's actually worked with quite small galleries as well. But it is wasteful in the sense that these materials can't be reused. This material gets dumped at the end. So I might have to freight the materials to the gallery, but I don't have to freight anything back. I am always delighted when I get to use a material that already exists in the world, that I don't have to kind of fabricate something new. It's not something that I stick to religiously or anything, but these straws I literally just bought off the shelf, and I don't transform them that much apart from the way that I've installed them. And I like that idea of not having to make anything new, not having to fabricate something. There's already a sort of factory pumping out billions of these every year, and I don't have to make any new molds. I don't have to kind of use any additional resources apart from those which are already getting produced. Doesn't necessarily make it sustainable, but these works are made from cheese. They, again, use a material bought straight off the shelf. And I mean shelf, I don't mean the fridge. These works were all made in Germany, and over there, cheese slices are just like any grocery item bought straight off the shelf, which is completely horrifying. And I figured that if the cheese, could sit on the shelf for like 9 months, then it would probably be, suitable as an art material. And so what I've done with these pieces is made very large sheets of cheese all sort of stuck together at the edges. So I just lay one at a time and sort of mosaic them and press the edges of them together. And then over a series of weeks and months, the cheese dries. And so it starts to curl at the edges, and then it starts to actually lift itself up off the ground and go quite firm, to the point where months later it's quite brittle and it can shatter. And the coloured fats from the cheeses start to leach out and create large puddles on the floor. In the display of these works, I've mopped all that up because it was pretty disgusting. But the colour also leaches out of the works over time, and you end up with something that kind of looks quite bleached, such as in this slide. And so these sculptures can be really quite large because they're made on site, a couple of meters long. They're quite economical. A large sculpture might only cost 30 or 40 euro to make, and I don't have to transport them anywhere. And that's important for me personally, because the transportation for something so delicate, national or international, is extremely laborious and expensive and a big use of resources. I've found that transporting delicate works, often the actual crates can use so much more resources than the actual sculpture itself. So I like to keep these works as something that is made on site. Yes, that does often mean that I personally have to travel on site to that space to do it, but that's the system in which these works are made. They get chucked in the bin at the end of their display at this stage. I don't think anyone would be welcoming these ones into their collection. There's not much space in public collections for anything remotely ephemeral, or food-based, in my experience of what I've seen. But I do believe they are actually quite sturdy and would last many, many years. The smell of these works is quite strong as well. I'm just going back to the sensory experience of my work. They don't smell rotten. I don't think this cheese is capable of rotting. I think that it's just about sort of remaining the same for as long as possible. And so these works kind of have a lovely, warm, cheesy smell for the course of their life. In various overseas residencies, I've found that there's this problem with making work and not quite knowing how to get it back home. In kind of thinking that through, I've problem solved that through this series of works called Linens. So in a stint over in Helsinki, I was kind of collecting fabrics and doing some fabric printing, and I started to bring these together in these sort of fabric collages. And it was many years later that I was sort of slowly working on these, but until I started to actually introduce it into my work. Initially, I was making them and giving them as gifts to people as kind of nice, laborious ways of saying thank you. And now they're actually part of the art practice as well. And so, as I said, these works use a lot of scraps of fabric that I've used to test ideas. So potato printing, as you'll see in this work, is a really large part of my practice. I've been potato printing for about 12 years or so. And the potato printing is a way of bringing together the kitchen and the studio in one place. And so when I'm kind of trying to test out new colors, new forms, new ways of using potato printing, I'm like testing on fabric. And I ended up with this very large box of these test prints. And I looked at this eventually and realized that there was a body of work in making use of these. And it was actually through COVID, which actually allowed me to kind of reflect on that time at home and seeing what was already there and what was already available, and having a child as well. A lot of non-time, you have no time, and lots of time, I don't really know. But somehow it seemed appropriate to kind of sit and stitch. And so these works kind of get collaged together. This is perhaps a better slide to demonstrate that. These are some smaller works, more like 1 meter by 1 meter wide. And you can see they use different patterns of these kind of prints and bring them together in what I call linens. They don't use, again, this kind of idea of potato printing and using like fresh produce to make painting. It has been brought up in the past. A work like this, even though it's huge, it's 220 centimeters squared, it really only uses about 2 or 3 kilos of kit for potatoes in its production. The stamping potatoes get used again and again until they're completely depleted and won't give me that nice crisp image, and that's when I start to replace them. So it actually doesn't use, even though there is this feeling in the works of excess, it doesn't really use that much of that fresh produce. But I have also tried to make it a habit of composting the paint-free parts of the potato as well. The other thing that's really important to note about these works, and I flagged it at the beginning of talking about the linens, is that these works are easily transported. So as opposed to something like a painting, which is extremely difficult to move around the world, these works can roll up and get transported quite easily, even potentially on a plane. So I designed these works in the first instance to be easily movable, easily transportable, and that saves me time, money, but it reduces the amount of packaging that we have to use to move these things around the world. The wallpapers that I produce are artworks, but they're also used quite heavily in installations that I create, which I'll show you in a moment. I've made maybe a dozen or so wallpapers throughout my career, and they pretty much all use quite a limited amount of material in their production. I'm photographing objects, sometimes plants. I don't even have to, take the plants away from the natural environment. I photograph them on site. Other times, for example, in the bottom right, this pink wallpaper uses materials borrowed from the Queensland Museum, but it's always very resourceful. It kind of comes down to somewhere between 6 and 20 photographs that I need to take. And then the works use the excess and the repetition of wallpaper to have a fairly big impact in the space. So I do think there's a resourcefulness to these works, which is completely contradicted by the delivery, which is extremely wasteful. To make these works and to produce large installations, you need to print quite large quantities, such as this, the Melbourne Art Fair. I can print this wallpaper on very durable material that can be reused, so it gets pasted up like any wallpaper and then pulled off, and then it can be installed in another space. It costs about twice as much, and not yet have I kind of met a team or a museum who wants to, double the price of their wallpaper, which is a big cost. And then there's also the chance that, once it's been cut down and already used, it's not going to fit the next space anyway. So there is sort of this potential way of making this work more sustainable, and yet I haven't quite been able to figure out how to make that work so far. So the wallpapers get printed on material that can get pulled off, but it's not suitable for reuse in another space. But I do use it as wrapping paper and samples as well for future installations. So I do end up using it. But while the work in terms of its actual construction, using the photographs and Photoshop, is very resourceful, the actual delivery is very tricky. These works are called licks. A lot of my sculptures come about through kind of mining the local supermarkets and trying to find things that interest me, and then bringing them home and finding out their sculptural capabilities or potentials. In this case, with these puffed corn snacks, the sort of perfect example of mechanical extrusion. You can lick them and stick them together. And so these sculptures are stuck together entirely with saliva. So what I do is I get a box, I fill the box with these corn puffs, and just sort of by licking the edges and sticking them to one another and licking the edges over a course of weeks, these sculptures are made. And I mean, like I said before with the sherbet, this is a material that already exists in the world. I don't have to produce anything new. In Australia, it's sold as baby food, which is a bit horrific if I totally fed them to my child. But they seem to be embedded in something real like corn, but they are so heavily transformed into something that's quite ergonomic and easy to eat and sort of dissolves in your mouth. And it's that dissolving quality which actually makes them perfect as a sculptural material. They're super light, so they transport very easily. They are essentially, packing material. As a child, I remember my father packing things in boxes with an almost identical rice product. And so, they're fairly easy to transport, but they do have a life. They're only going to last so long. And they biodegradable. You could say that they're not going to be a massive pollutant on the world, but it uses what you could argue is a fairly large amount of material. It depends. Maybe the cardboard that these works are displayed on is actually more wasteful. In a work like this, it's the packaging, which is actually unbelievable. Because there's only like 20 of these little wormies in a bag, and the amount of packaging that I'm left with is absurd. I'm going to, for the last 10 minutes, talk about some work which specifically use recycled materials, which are usually the cheapest. These works are wine press membranes, which have stretched into paintings. So I came across these materials on a wine residency, which was a partnership with AWRI, Australian Wine Research Institute, and ANAT, Australian Network of Art and Technology, down in Adelaide. And at one of the wineries, I came across this, somebody was showing me around, and I came across this like large, it's like a tarp, but it's not a tarp, it's like a large plastic membrane, which it turns out is the thing that squashes the grapes. So this plastic is kind of inflated inside a very large drum and squashes the grapes against this sort of big sieve, and all the juice comes out. And in the process of kind of crushing over and over again for many years, this membrane, this tough plastic membrane, turns the color of red wine, and it stinks like a kind of pub carpet as well. And so I was super excited about this material. The white one on the right has not been stained by red grapes, but it was also stored in a really funny way, which is where all those lovely markings come from. So these materials are essentially on the trash pile. They winemakers do sometimes use them as a tarp to cover something and keep it waterproof, because it's a very durable material. They can get repurposed in other ways, but typically they're an industrial product that gets tossed after it's got a hole or something in it, because sometimes they get pierced by a piece of vine or something like that. And so I've been lucky to get my hands on a couple of these, and they're huge. They're 10, 15 meters long sometimes, and I cut those up to make these very large smelly painting. This work uses a plant that I found in nature. As I earlier mentioned, I did residency at New England Regional Art Museum, and they have a wonderful print studio underneath their building. And so I spent some time there, and I was collecting, specifically wanted to work on this plant, St. John's wort, because it's a massive weed problem down there, and it's causes some really bad problems when cattle or different livestock eat it. It gives them photosensitivity. We can use it as humans as an antidepressant, a mild antidepressant. So you might have actually bought this as a sort of vitamin supplement off the shelf. But like I said, it's a weed, especially in the cooler climates here in Australia. So removing it from the land, you could say is a good thing. I went and harvested a whole heap of this, and using the print presses in the print studio in Narromine, I squashed the plant. And so these wonderful reddy purpley oils, which you can see as prints here, is actually antidepressant oils, which have been squeezed out of the flowers. And then I've scanned these as soon as they've been printed, and then on Photoshop reworked the prints into these sort of bouquets or doilies sort of shapes, which have become a wallpaper that I've gone on to show. And so sort of like I was talking about the wallpapers earlier, they are very resourceful in terms of using minimal amount of material with maximum impact. They can get repeated and printed very large, but also I do use plants a lot, specifically edible plants. And in this particular case, I've used a plant that is a weed in Australia to produce work. My collage is a constant in my practice. It is something that I do when I have a lot of downtime or I don't have a lot of money, because I've got so much of this material backed up in my collection, and I can just kind of sift through it and see what I need to do next. And it's all been drawn from secondhand cookbooks. We have an event here in Brisbane called Lifeline Book Fest, and that's where they bring out millions, if not billions, of books that have been donated. And I mean, if you're a book lover, it could seem quite terrible to cut up books, but if you've seen the book fest, you'll understand the mass of books, secondhand books that are out there, and the hesitation wears off. So while I used to kind of collect these books and think, oh my God, they're so gorgeous, and I used to scan them in and be really careful with them, I just kind of hack them up now. And so these bodies of collage are made from collecting masses of books of particular topics. So in this case, it was fruitcake. This body of work was in response to a sort of very English food culture here in Australia, but also something quite festive, kind of Christmassy kind of vibe with these works, with all the lovely almond and cherry kind of decorations. They're quite large collages that end up being 1-2 meters wide. And then what I do is I scan them, and they become editions that can get printed off and shown that way. So there's something a bit more economical or sustainable about that process of working intensely on one object and then producing a couple of copies of it. But it will also last a long time that way too. Another series of collages, I mean, they come in many different forms. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm looking at the material and responding to what I can find. These are sort of based off terrain imagery that I find in a lot of European cookbooks, and these are much smaller works, but again, they are using vintage or recycled secondhand cookbooks. And then a work like this, I don't need to talk too much about it because it's essentially the same materials. In this case, though, it's a site responsive work. So I did a residency at Museum of Brisbane and spent 2 or 3 weeks producing this work on site, where I've cut out these faces, trying to make kind of different personalities out of this grotesque but also nostalgic material of the cookbooks, and then glued them directly on the wall. But just before I glue them up, I also scan them at a high quality so that I can keep reusing that material that I'm producing along the way, potentially creating another wallpaper out of it as well, giving the material another life. This is the last work I'll talk about, and then we can kind of wrap up and have a bit of a chat about questions if you've got any. I do a lot of timber work in my practice in the construction of sculpture and this sort of sculptural furniture. So these works, which were shown at Caloundra Regional Gallery in an exhibition called Pith, use local timbers that I've sourced from lumber yards, specifically tried to source fruit tree timbers. So as I understand it, on the Sunshine Coast, there's a lot of people moving in and not necessarily wanting to use farmland in the way that it was. There's a lot of fruit trees essentially getting cut down because people don't want to produce food, which is what the land was doing before that. Well, for at least, in a colonial sense. And so there's a lot of these fruit timbers around from, mango, avocado. This specific work uses mango, lily pilly, and pecan, and has combined those timbers into these sculptures. And they get used for dining performances in the gallery. And they also get used here as quite minimal sculptures with glass on the top. And then I've carved into them. So again, kind of harking back to this English food culture or European food culture here in Australia, I've kind of created shortbread molds, carvings, indentations into the timbers. These works, as well as being kind of using recycled or discarded, not very popular timber materials, some of them are recycled from, say, old houses and things, or old posts and things, but they're also flat pack. Again, there's no way for me to store these sorts of things as they are. So the legs come off these and they can be stored flat, kind of IKEA furniture-ish, but also they can be hung on the wall as paintings. So in this instance, and in the instance of other furniture that I've made, the tabletops can hang on the wall like a frame, a painting, and then the legs can get slotted inside the sculptures. And so they can be shown in different iterations. So that flexibility helps me as an artist design different exhibitions, not having to always produce new work, but also to sort of be a bit more flexible with the way that the works read and to sort of speak to different things in different contexts. I have just got one last slide. I don't think there's anything else. I just wanted to share one more slide, and that's just some context for my work. So these are artists who I felt were relevant in terms of what I've been talking about throughout this presentation, which may or may not be useful, but they're works that I really love and admire, and I felt like they have similar tendencies to kind of consume materials for installation and sculptural works. And so I just wanted to end on that as a as a nod to some artists that have inspired me, but that all could also be considered in relation to my work. I have Simone here.
Yeah. Coming back in. So we do have one question that came in during it, and it's from James. In the context of things like smells, residue, decay, etc., I'm curious as to what discussions you have with galleries in terms of public health and safety and putting the gallery at ease with regards to these considerations.
Yeah, good one. It's becoming more and more of a concern. On one hand, especially with COVID, works like the chocolate paintings or the Goosebump piece where the biscuit's a bit off the wall, these works won't necessarily happen in the same way anymore. Goosebump was actually on show in a museum right when COVID hit, and they kind of just put an end to all their participation on their work, and that's totally valid. But I think that from here on in, those directly engaging works might not happen as much. They might not happen in the same way. As to the other works which decay and change over time, they are problematic for galleries or museums who have a collection. So there's a lot of instances where galleries or museums have a collection that's offsite, or they don't have one at all. And so that's not that big a deal. Sometimes it just doesn't even get brought up. And then other times the work, it's a conversation. And those conversations can be quite simple, or they can be really difficult and take many months. I think that the further I go into mid-career art practice, the more these conversations are happening. And I guess all I would say is that the practice is very varied. There's a lot of different, tangents and things to pull from, the collage works, the wallpapers, these things, the sculptures don't necessarily cause any problems. So there's always a way to work with an institution, but my goal is to try not to change the work too much and trying not to respond to those challenges when they turn up, responding to them in the right way that retains the integrity of the work and makes sure it communicates in the way that I want, but also trying not to change the practice in response to those issues.
Okay, so we have another question. I'm teaching high school students visual art subject next year, and I'm just wondering if you have done any artwork with food as a medium with younger people. If you have, could you please give me some ideas?
Yeah, I do a lot of workshops. I did one last week in high schools. I have ways of thinking about my practice through the lens of workshops and teaching. I think that it's, for me, working in high school contexts, it's important to just play and make sure that you're not too concerned about the finished product. That's my particular approach. So I think food printing, like I do a lot of potato printing, but food printing in general is one that typically the resources are already in a classroom. You've got sponge rollers and acrylic paints and printing onto fabrics or paper, printing onto pretty much anything with different kinds of foods is a really easy process to introduce to high school students. And it lends itself to pattern making and things really easily. But otherwise, collage, it's not as exciting. But I think that, like I said, there's a lot of cookbooks out there and they have really fascinating imagery that's quite grotesque or abject. And these sorts of materials are quite open-ended and could be used in collaging activities. But I also think the students can bring their own ideas in terms of, like, I often think about the rituals that people have in their lives and how they can be brought into the classroom. So if you were to ask students what their food rituals are and to consider how those rituals, such as making tea or reading recipes with family, the kinds of snacks or lollies that they eat, these sorts of materials can be brought in and you can encourage play as well. I don't want to go too deep into all the different sorts of lessons plans that I do and things as well, but I'd also be happy to have people email me and for some specific responses as well. That's fine.
Yeah. Also the performance element as well is something that's of food as well.
Yeah, and the traces as well, trying to get them to capture traces of eating.
Another question is, how do you manage the tension of the choices between sustainability goals and getting the work made as you envisage it?
I will often sacrifice a lot for the work, whether that's financially or time. my time resources. And so I'll often prioritize the work, but sometimes it's just too absurd, getting the work made the way that I originally envisaged it. But every problem, every challenge is an opportunity in my eyes. And if you spend enough time with it, there's, so many valid tangents to how a work can kind of finally enter the world. So when I come across a problem, I can't afford to get something cast in bronze, or I can't afford to, custom, fabricate this particular food, or it's too fragile to kind of make it to the gallery. It just, sometimes it's going completely back to the drawing board. Yeah, I hope that a problem each time is an opportunity. But like I said, if it's manageable, I'll actually sacrifice. If I feel like it's worth it, I'll sacrifice a lot to make sure that work makes it into the world the way I wanted it, to my detriment sometimes.
I guess also it becomes about the sustainability of that, or there's like a transient nature to the work as well, which is this other element, because it's not like conservation quality materials.
So sometimes I'll make the work with my own funds and really bury myself into it the first time, knowing that I'll never do that again. Like next time somebody else needs to kind of put their resources in it, and maybe I need an assistant, or maybe in the process of making it I'll come up with a better way of doing it. But yeah, it's a personal sort of sustainability thing as well.
Yeah. Another question. You said your food work can be viewed as wasteful. How do you respond to viewers that may see your food-based works as wasteful, particularly using animal-based products?
Yeah, definitely. Using animal-based products. Yeah, using another body. Look, the ethics of food are really important to me. I've been a vegetarian for a large portion of my life. The lives of animals are important to me. A lot of my research is around food culture and the way that it's kind of shaping our lives. It's a huge focus to me. I also before I had a child, did a lot of work volunteering with Oz Harvest. Food waste is an important topic for me. I hope that the work that I make is important enough, at least for me, to validate, to kind of make my choices worthwhile. And this is the question I ask myself constantly. And sometimes when I make a work, it can actually change people's attitudes towards food, and that has a flow-on effect. If you can change someone's mind, if you can change their view, that's kind of worth it in my eyes. But as I sort of flagged at the beginning of the talk, I feel like material is material, and along the way, any material is wasteful. Richard Serra's work is immense, uses tons of metal, and yet, maybe people don't have this conversation with him. Mining is an incredibly wasteful industry. Even the groceries, supermarkets waste. I've seen how much food they waste. There's waste from food events. There's waste from the industrial processing. There is waste at every point. My contribution to that waste is small enough, yet hopefully I feel like it's a valuable contribution to that conversation. But that's a complete contradiction as well, because I'm totally taking part of it. And I don't mind that that's a contradiction, because it sparks conversation. It just comes back to this thing of we feel it in our guts when we see so much food on display, and we feel like it doesn't have this role as nourishment in our lives. And it's in the work, and it's part of the conversation of the work.
Does anyone have any other last minute questions that you might have for Liz? I think we've got another one in here. No, we've got lots of thank yous. That looks like the end of the questions. So I'd like to thank everyone who's tuning in to the webinar for coming. It's been a fantastic discussion. I'd also like to thank Liz for taking the time and for sharing your knowledge with everyone here. I'd also, just before we go, like to make a quick reminder to everyone that this is part of a series of webinars webinars that we have, and we've got a full program at Flying Arts up until the end of the year. The next week we have Accessible Arts Practices with Madeline Little, who's from Access Arts, which will be a really valuable discussion around how to make your art practice and also your organisations accessible. And then also another one on public art with Simone Eisler at the beginning of November. We also have workshops including Embracing AI for Creativity with Jessie Hughes later in November. But you can jump onto our website and have a look at all of the programs that we have coming up. So thank you again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.